Hello everyone. Hopefully by now we understand a little bit more about what the DOM is and can begin exploring specific aspects of the DOM. We're going to start in this tutorial by just exploring how to retrieve elements from the DOM using a variety of different techniques. So I've just started up a new HTML page. Make sure that when you start a new file it is HTML here. I've called mine intro web page so I can write all my HTML code, all my CSS and my JavaScript code in here, and I can run it in my browser here. I also navigated away from Zenva.com and have just opened up a blank new tab. So once you guys have started up your new file, let's get ready to write some actual code. So we're going to start just by adding a little bit of HTML. I'll just start with the classic head and body tags. Okay, we're not going to put anything in the head tag for right now, just because I'm not too interested in styling anything up, but we're going to put just a couple of elements in our body here. So let's start off with just a basic div. Okay, and let's also add in a button. And let's just close out that tag. Okay, so our basic div here is just going to say the classic hello world. Okay, and our button will just say something like press me. Now, because we're going to need at least IDs or class names or something like that, we're actually going to give each of these guys both of those. So we'll give them first a class. Let's call this, actually let's just copy that. I'm feeling a little uncreative today, so let's just call these class 1. Okay, so they both belong to the same class here, but we'll give them unique IDs, as IDs do need to be unique. Okay, so we'll set the ID here equal to just div1, and we'll set the ID down here equal to just button1. Feel free to choose different class and ID names, just make sure that the classes are the same but the IDs are different. Okay, we're not going to bother attaching the onClick or anything to the button just yet because we are not going to demonstrate that functionality yet. So as long as we save this and were to actually run the page, so let me find where I've saved mine. I've called mine again intro web page, so if I just double click, it'll run my page here. Keep in mind this isn't the published version of this site. This is just a way to preview how the file looks and how our browser is interpreting it. So as you can see, hello world is the text. There's a button that says press me. It doesn't really do anything. That's what we'd expect. So let's come on back to the code. Now there are several different ways in which we can retrieve HTML elements using the DOM, but all of them require some script which we'll put inside of a script tag. Okay, so let's just open this guy up. And this is where we can put all of our JavaScript. So any code here is interpreted as JavaScript. Typically I stick this at the bottom of the body, but could actually go outside, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we're going to look at, again, 5 different ways to access elements. The first is going to be by class name, second will be by ID, third will be by tag name, the fourth will be by just a single query selector, and the fifth is going to be a query selector all. So I'll talk a little bit about how to do each one and what the advantages or disadvantages are. So let's start with the class name. I'm going to create my variable called class1, and I'm going to set this equal to my document. This is how we begin most of our retrievals because there are no other root elements. I mean, there's the body here, but we might as well just go within document. And we're going to get, let me just expand that out, element by, actually we're going for class name, so we want get elements, plural, by class name. Okay, we'll open up the brackets. In here, we'll put the name of the class. No need for the dot here because we know we're talking about classes. And we're just going to search for everything under the name class1. You can add the semicolon if you want. It's purely optional. So what exactly is going on here? We're calling upon the document because remember in the document object model, the document is our root element, okay? And we're going to search within all of the document's children, indirect or direct children. We're going to search for everything that has this class name class1. In our case, both the div and the button have class 1, but if we had some other div that was, had a different class or wasn't assigned any class, that wouldn't be collected in my variable class 1 here. As well, what this means, because we're using the document as the root, if I had, let's say, I have a div here class 1, and then let's say I had another div, okay, and within this, I had a div that also had the class 1, so something like this. Class equals class1. Obviously, would need the quotes. Well, in this case, this div would also be called, but not this parent div. The reason is because this parent div doesn't have the class1, but this one does. Okay, so at this point in time, class1 variable here represents this class or this div, this button, and this div, but not this one, okay? So it's just everything that's found with that particular class name. Now, because it's getElements plural, we're going to retrieve every single instance of that. So my class1 variable now is an array, rather, of 2 members. It's an array with this first div, and it's an array with this button. So we can kind of think about each of the elements of this array being pointers to each of these HTML elements. I could then, for example, get the HTML of my first div, which should be hello world. So if I created an alert that calls upon my class1 at index 0, because class1 is now an array, and I wanted my inner HTML, I can call upon this function inner HTML. That's how you'd get all the HTML within an element. Okay, and if I were to save this, just press Command S to save it, and refresh this page, we now get this alert popping up saying hello world. So we can just dismiss that. Now the reason we get that alert is because I'm calling upon the alert function here, and as for the text of the alert, it's getting my class1. Class1 is getting all of these elements here, and it's getting the very first member, in this case this is my div, and it's getting all of the HTML it finds in the div, which is just everything here. If I'd had another div within here and some text, it would get that div and the text as well. This also means that even if there's only one element with the class name class1, it's still stuck in an array. It's just that array has only one element. Okay, so typically if we get multiple elements, we'll probably have to use some kind of a looping system to loop over them unless we know the specific index. Okay, so that's how to get multiple elements by their class name. Now, let's say we want only one specific element and we actually know what its ID is. Well, we can call a very similar method, but this is going to be called getElement by ID rather than getElements by class name. So let's say I want just my button. Okay, well, I can call upon my button stored in a variable. Let's call this just button1. This is going to be equal to my document, as that document is going to be the root. We're going to get element by ID. And again, just like with the class name, we simply put the ID, which in my case is just button1. And now if I want my button1's inner HTML, I could call upon my alert function, and I'm just going to call upon button1.inner HTML. If I save this, what result do you think I'd get? Well, I'm getting this element, this button, and any text within it. So I should just get the text being printed out saying press me. So we'll refresh this. Page says press me, which is exactly what we'd expect. So similar process, it's just instead of calling upon the class name, we're calling upon the ID. And also we're only getting a single element, okay, button1, rather than a list of elements as in get by class name. So very handy if you know the specific ID of the element you want. Okay, so the next way we want to explore is going to be by tag name. Now, these are HTML tags such as body, head, div, button. These can be considered our tags, even script. So let's say we wanted all of the divs in our document, but we don't want any of the buttons, we don't want any of the list elements, anything like that. Well, we could create this variable, maybe this is going to be called divs, and we can call upon get our document dot get elements, this is plural, by tag name. Okay, and in here we're going to put the tag name div, notice the capitalization. And this will return me a list, just like with class name, of all of the elements that have this tag of div, or this tag here of div. So now if I want to show an alert of this, I'd call upon my divs. I want the first index, because actually in my case there's only one element anyway, and we're just going to get the inner HTML from that. So we should just get our page saying hello world, and the alert does indeed say hello world. Okay, so we'll get all of my elements that have this tag. Similarly, I could have put button here instead of div, and that would get me all of my buttons. So useful if you want all of the elements of a specific type, but I would say honestly overall less useful than the class name or ID. Okay, the fourth way of retrieving elements is going to be via using what's called the query selector. Now the query selector is arguably the most powerful of all of these because it combines all of the functionality into one function. So using my query selector, I can find elements by their class name, by their ID name, by their tag name, or even more than that. I can even search for elements by their HTML name, or rather HTML itself, or by even attributes. So for example, if I had a bunch of buttons that were blue, then I could call upon everything with the attribute color equal to blue, and it would retrieve me all of those elements there. Now keep in mind the method document.query selector, this is how we do it. This actually just retrieves the first instance of this. So for example, if I call upon the first instance of everything found under the class 1, so this is the class syntax dot, whereas with ID it would be like this. If I find everything under this class and store it within a variable, so let's just call this first, and then I print this out, this will just retrieve me this first div here. It won't retrieve me the button, even though these are both in class 1. To retrieve all of the occurrences of this, we're going to have to use the next method called query selector all. So let's call this variable all, and this is going to be my document.query selector. Oops, spelling that wrong. Query selector all, and then we can get again .class 1, and that's going to return us all instances of class 1. So now if I just printed out my first .inner HTML, okay, so save and refresh, get hello world, that's exactly what I would expect. Okay, whereas if I print out, let's say my all of 1, so this should be the second member of this array, then I get press me being printed out because that second member is indeed this button. So those are your 5 basic ways of retrieving elements. There are actually, in fact, other ways, but I find these are the more commonly used ones. I will just leave with one extra note. So far we don't have any really nested elements. I mean, everything is nested within the body, but I don't really count that. So let's just take a look at an example of a nested element. So this div right now says hello world. Let's actually just create another div inside of it. So div, and we'll just close the tag off. And now this one is going to just again say hello world. Wow, really can't type today. So it's going to say hello world. We're going to give this a class. This time we're going to give this again the title of class 1. But look and see what happens when I call not upon my document as the root element, but upon this div here. So let's actually just move that alert down. Let's say I have actually my first div. Actually, I don't have my first div. So let's create that. Let's call this variable first div, or actually div1 should be fine. This is just going to be equal to our get element by ID. We want to pass in the document.get element by ID. We want to pass in the ID of div1. Div1, there we go. Okay, so div1 now is a pointer to this div and all of the content within it. So if I call upon, let's say, inner div equal to my div1 dot get elements by class name, because this guy doesn't have an ID yet, and we get elements by the class name, class 1. Okay, my inner div, actually I guess I should say inner divs because this is plural, my inner divs will actually contain only this inner div here, even though there are 3 elements with the name class 1. So actually, let's break things up a little bit. Let's have this say hello to start off with, and this one is just going to say world with the space. Actually, yeah, let's have that. Okay, so my class 1 div1 has hello, and my inner div here, which is still class 1, just says world here. So if I alert my inner divs at index 0, so inner divs index 0, let's see what gets printed out here. Well, it just says world here, even though there are actually 3 elements on the page that have this class 1 name. The reason we're actually only getting the HTML from one of them, specifically this inner div, is because my root element is no longer my document. My root element is, in fact, my div1 here. So rather than querying the entire page and looking for everything with class 1, we're actually just searching this one branch here that corresponds with div1. So we completely ignore this guy, and we completely ignore this class 1 div as well. Okay, so that's how you search a specific branch rather than the entire document. But otherwise, those are the common ways of retrieving elements. Before we move on to the next section, I'll just quickly summarize what we did here, and then we can move on. So we just set up some basic HTML. We have an outer div with its inner div inside, and then just a button that says press me. It's not doing anything yet. Then we opened up some JavaScript and explored 5 different ways in which to retrieve elements. So we can retrieve multiple elements by class name, that returns a list. We can retrieve one element by its ID, it's just a single element. We can retrieve multiple elements by their tag name, so again that's another list. we can retrieve the first occurrence of this text here using the query selector, and we can retrieve all occurrences using query selector all. Then we saw that specifying the root element actually does matter, because this will allow us to select only certain branches versus the entire document. So the entire document accesses everything in the HTML page. Just by specifying a branch name as the root element, we get only everything within that single branch. And we can also print out the inner HTML simply by calling upon the element name in a variable, and then printing out .innerHTML, and then just setting this in an alert. Keep in mind, if, for example, I printed my div1's inner HTML, it wouldn't just print out hello, it would also print out this code as well, because this is technically still part of its HTML, as long as it's between the tags. But now that basic intro is out the way, let's wrap this section up. Let's move on to the next one, in which we'll learn how to access and modify the element's attributes.